Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Salty Fitness Podcast. Today, we're going to do a foundational podcast about Ray Peat. And we're doing this because we take a lot of information from him. I'd say he's kind of like the godfather of the bioenergetic view, even though he's not the originator. He is one that has moved the ball forward quite a bit. So we're going to do a little background. First, we're going to listen to Dr. Peat describe himself, and then we'll talk about some of his most controversial stances, look at his overall view of hormones. So I think this will be helpful for you if you're not aware of Dr. Peat to get to know a little bit about him. So let's start listening in now.
In 1968, after studying many other things for about 12 years after getting out of college, I went to graduate school at the University of Oregon, specializing in reproductive physiology. Did my dissertation in 1972 on oxidative changes in the uterus with aging. And that had been one of my lifelong interests, was the physiology of aging. And it seemed especially relevant to the process of reproduction, because I had seen publications in the 40s and 50s in which they saw that when you make a graph of the baby's birth weight and head circumference, that both of these increase with each subsequent pregnancy, so that the older the mother is, the bigger her baby's brain is. That held true up until about the age of 38, and at that time, women were having many more babies each, and so it tended to be the third or fourth or fifth baby by the time she reached her late 30s. And at that point, instead of increasing the last birth before she became infertile, the last baby tended to be lighter with a smaller head. But the general drift of both aging and parity was for the birth weight and brain weight to increase steadily. And that was sort of in the background. I had started out intending to study brain physiology in graduate school, but I found that that subject was completely dogmatic, where the reproductive physiology actually tolerated a scientific approach.
So that was a little helpful introduction, and I know he went on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but the connection he's making is between studying brain development, aging, and reproduction, because that brain development begins way back there, even from the beginning at conception. How healthy is the mother, and how will that child develop both in the womb and then afterwards? So I find it really interesting, his time of being on the earth between 36 and he died just a handful of years ago. This was a time of pretty massive changes in the medical industry. And this is where you start to have the ideas of pharmaceuticals being a huge potential income money driver. And at the same time, you have other industries looking to utilize a lot of their waste products, seeing how they could use those waste products for turning a profit. And that's basically what you have in polyunsaturated fats. This is also what you have with the estrogens and using estrogen as a hormonal therapy. So these things, we're not going to go into depth on that, but this is just interesting because he grew up in a time where there was a lot of research kind of right around in pre-1940s, 50s that would fly directly in the face of the post like 1950s, 60s research. It's like it did a flip on certain things that were patentable, and as far as pharmaceuticals, and things that were cheap to create and make. So I also find it interesting in the middle of this that the first chronic drug to be used, before this time, most of the pharmacy efforts were aimed at acute illnesses, acute infections. There was never a chronic drug, the idea of, you need to get on this and you need to stay on this like a statin, like metformin, you need to stay on this for the rest of your life. And this will slow down your disease progress. Normally, the idea was, can we reverse this disease? How do we get rid of it? And how do we stop someone from dying? So it's interesting to me that the first chronic drug, in other words, the first drug really officially approved to be on for long term, was birth control. Birth control being a synthetic estrogen and a progestin, which is the synthetic version, the patentable version of progesterone. So I think that's definitely something like a judgment of God that we started here, and we can see the huge downfall of our health and of our system. And it's really, how it's used to how birth control is used in the 60s and so on. That was really a reflection of who we were as a people in our rebellion to God. And now it looks like, there are consequences for our rebellion. So synthetic estrogen was even promoted for women in pregnancy. And I'm mentioning estrogen a lot because a lot of his study was done in that field of estrogen. And again, this is the time period that he lived. He got to see the research before, the research completely contradictory afterwards, and got to see the health industry rise to what it is now, which is the most profitable industry there is, even above entertainment, even above technology, is healthcare, so-called healthcare. But back to estrogen here, it was used all the way up until 1971, where they had to cut it off because it was so obvious that it was doing all of these things, just terrible for pregnant women, causing cancer, causing miscarriages, which it was promoted as being able to help, causing infertility, birth defects, all kinds of just terrible results. And I would say that from my observations, it was right around the 70s and 80s where you really start to see the longer term effects of some of these things being introduced, including PUFAs up here. You don't see the effects short term always and right away, but when you look at our health history, you see this big drop off begin right around the 70s and 80s, which is right where I was born in 81. And so since that time, there's been these consequences. These are just a couple, but these are some of the most wild, consequences that you can drop fertility within one generation by 50%. I mean, that's wild. Men's testosterone is right there, about the same. And remember, fertility means it's both in men and women, not just women. Now we've managed somehow to turn the ship on our longevity, being the first generation since we were a nation to not progress our lifespan by a generation to generation, but we are now turning the ship. We are going downwards, and we're the first ones to do that. And obviously the massive upturn and all of this incidence of chronic disease and cancer, this is where, Ray Peat is unique in his approach of the idea that we have way more agency over our bodies, as opposed to the mainstream, especially big pharma view that wants to push genetics. And there's reasons for that. Number one, if the doctor tells you, you just genetically have high blood pressure, well, what are you going to do about it? You can't do anything about it. Don't try, just take our medication for life. That's the idea in short. So let's look at this. This is going to be fun. This will give you at least an idea of where he ended up with his research, with his findings. He expanded quite a bit off of just estrogen and reproductive health and aging, but it really just impacts everything. And you really catch that with this first quote, which is also on our site, where he says, "Energy is the central factor that determines structure, function, and repair of the human body. So our ability, our efficiency, our capacity to produce energy through the mitochondria, that is what powers the cell that God created to do what it was supposed to do, its job. So you have a liver cell, and the liver cell has a specific job. It will do its job to the degree that it has energy. Same thing with your lung cell, your muscle cell, your heart cell, your brain cell. They all have different functions, but how well each of those cells are producing energy is how well it's going to do its job. When it is despairing in energy and suffocating of energy, it goes down the long spectrum of a downturn all the way through all those chronic diseases, so-called autoimmune diseases, all the way down to cancer, where you have immature cells replicating. So let's look at a couple other stances that he took. And this is related to this quote. Mitochondrial dysfunction is central to aging, cancer, and just our overall degeneration of our body and cells. I just explained that pretty well. Cancer, like I mentioned, is really a metabolic disease, and he wasn't the first to say that, but he caught on to other research in the past that had been there saying, actually, this isn't so genetic, this is very metabolic. And then the gut issues can be widely misunderstood. Endotoxin is a product really of poor energy and in the gut. And it is a major driver of systemic inflammation really being the driver to all of these things, aging, cancer, just general degeneration of cells. Okay, so all this in general should be saying to you, like, perhaps we do have a lot more agency over our health, and we're not just pegged by our genetics to suffer certain diseases and whatnot. That's a very different view than you're going to get from mainstream medicine. Here's a couple on estrogen. Some of these are in quotes. So they're quotes. Some of them are ideas, not direct quotes. But here's a quote. Estrogen is not the primary female hormone. This has been pushed by mainstream medicine when they found that estrogen is extremely cheap to make. You can patent it. You can literally make it from soot, from smoke. And it's extremely cheap. It's about 100 times cheaper to make than progesterone. Natural progesterone, of course, isn't patentable, so you can't really make money on it. I'll start with a quote again. Estrogen is not the primary female hormone. It is a stress hormone. It has a function, but it's a function of more of stress, something's wrong, not a good hormone we want high all the time. If there is such a thing as a primary female hormone, he continues, it's progesterone. Okay, next point. Estrogen is fundamentally inflammatory, carcinogenic, that means cancer-causing, and degenerative. That's why you would call it a stress hormone. Progesterone, on the other hand, is protective, and this means both in men and women, but particularly in women and at different and varying levels throughout their cycle. Here's a quote. Hormone supplementation is required to reach normal levels just 50 years ago. In other words, a normal testosterone level for men is very hard to get now. We just, the doctor will just, not the doctor, but the industry, medical industry, would just keep lowering the standards as they get averages of the average man today. They just keep lowering that standard. So a very high testosterone in a man today was probably a very mid-range to low-range testosterone level in a man in 1980, So this deals with the idea of, like, some people are rightfully hesitant to say, oh, I don't know about taking hormones. Most of that, I think, is rightly feared because of what mainstream medicine has done with hormones, mainly using the stress hormones for treatment. So Ray was pretty keen on supplementing things like progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA to a certain point. But a lot of people would fear that. But I would say that's because of how mainstream has used hormones, not a good way to use the actual youth-associated hormones. And we'll go over some of those in just a minute. Lastly, in this category, stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline drive most chronic disease, including diabetes, heart issues, autoimmune diseases, all the way to cancer. Here's another one. This is a quote: "Light is healthy, darkness is unhealthy." And one of those things he's talking about with darkness, a darkness associated hormone, is perhaps surprisingly to some of you, serotonin. This is another big medical industry trick lie, is to say serotonin is the happy hormone. It is, in fact, what he would say harmful in excess and contributes to depression and disease. And we have a whole category of drugs that increase serotonin. These are called SSRIs. And that is a huge industry that is flying in the face of what Ray Peat would say about serotonin. Most psychiatric drugs, he would say, worsen long-term outcomes. And this is really true. There can be some short-term effect of SSRIs, especially to almost just kind of numb you, which is a stress response of serotonin. It's actually useful to help bring all emotions, kind of flatten them for the sake of a short-term acute stress, but not for long-term help. That does not help. It actually creates problems being long-term in your body. Kind of like if you could imagine, using a generator, but using it inside of your house. It's not meant to be the primary source of electricity and power, but it not only is not very efficient, it also will end up causing more destruction in the end, if you have it in your house. And lastly, one more point in this area: learned helplessness, he would say, has a biological, not so much psychological basis. He would say our hormone, our milieu, our mixture of hormones is really a big part of learned helplessness, because again, that's a stress state and it's a compensation, should be an acute state, not a long-term state. But you have, huge money in these SSRIs, which are making people pretty much helpless kind of people and charging them money for it. Okay, a little bit. Let's get into some food thoughts he had too. CICO, other words known as calories in, calories out. The idea that if you want to lose weight, you just have to eat less calories than you burn. If you gain weight, that's because you're eating more calories than you burn. He would say that idea is nonsense. He says the mere existence of the thyroid disproves it. And the reason he can say that is because you can take people and put them on whatever calorie in that you want, but you have someone that's hypothyroid, someone that has good, and compared to someone that has good thyroid, they're going to put on weight completely differently. So the thyroid, one of its main functions is to adjust the basal metabolic rate. So that's a long discussion, but in other words, I know this just frustrates a lot of people because they work really hard. They do hard calorie deficits. They might eat 1,500 calories a day, or they're doing intermittent fasting or skipping a day or two every week, and they still can't lose weight. And people, keep telling them, well, you're just eating too many calories. You just got to burn more calories. You just got to exercise more and eat less. Now, once in a while, that is true for some people, but I would say for almost the majority of people that are actually working at it, they're causing more problems by not eating enough than by trying to cut calories. So that's a huge one. This is so just ingrained in us that, just eating more is going to make you fat. Eating less will make you skinny. Exercising more makes you skinny and healthy. So there's some kernels of truth in there. You could be losing weight, but are you losing fat tissue, more fat tissue? For example, when you fast, even for a day or a couple of days, they've shown you're losing about 80% of muscle mass, 20% fat. So sure, your scale can look lower and, look, I'm fasting, I lost weight, but that is not what I would call healthy. That is, you are probably in a lower degree of health after that than you were before. He would say, another one, thyroid function is widely misdiagnosed and undertreated. And I've heard him say, and this was, a couple of decades ago, that he would estimate maybe 60+% of people are hypothyroid because of our current environment, food, what we eat, but now also other things, plastics, lighting, all those things. So I'm sure it would be probably even more. Let's keep going. TSH, so that's the thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is the measure that all doctors are taught to use to measure thyroid function. Ray Peat would say TSH is an inflammatory hormone, so we don't want it high, and a poor marker of thyroid health. A very poor marker because you can be falsely high or falsely low for lots of reasons. He would say the best way to measure it, and he's really working off Rhoda Barnes' work on the thyroid. They would say by far the better marker is really just a basal thermometer. And you check your mouth temperature first thing in the morning. And if it's below 97.8, then you're probably, there's a good chance you're hypothyroid. And that's a much better marker than TSH. All right, I'm talking too much. I'm going to just blow through some of these next ones just to blow your mind a little bit. Okay, sugar is a superfood, he's quoted as saying. He also would say sugar is protective. It's anti-stress, especially when metabolism is impaired already or you're in a high stress state. Another quote, coffee, chocolate, sugar, ice cream are addictive, air quotes, because they're good for you. I love it. I'm just going to leave that where it is. Salads and vegetables are not health foods. Amen. Low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets are physiologically stressful long term. Low carb diets would be even things like carnivore, but definitely keto, especially. And I'm going to just leave it at that. He would say that all unsaturated fats, that means polyunsaturated fats, that's omega-6 fats, but also omega-3 fatty acids, the ones that almost everybody supplements. I think it's like the number 2 or 3 supplement in the country. All unsaturated fats are unhealthy and accelerate aging. Next quote, healthy gut microbiome, the so-called healthy gut microbiome, he would say is rubbish. There is no such thing. Yes, so lots to explain, but I'm giving you the overview of where he is, not explaining how we get to those conclusions. Carbon dioxide is a huge component for him and for this bioenergetic view, and is even more important than oxygen, he would say. Cholesterol is protective in opposition to what most mainstream medicine would say. Cholesterol is protective and necessary for hormone production. So we're talking about all the hormones, but especially like the thyroid hormone, your testosterone. These are all made from cholesterol. And actually, they've shown that, especially in aging men, the higher their cholesterol is, the better their health and longevity. So those are some controversial stances that he has taken with his life studies. Lastly, let's look at this overall picture of hormones and other substances that are generally considered good in his view versus those that are considered harmful. All right, so let's start with protective hormones, those that are good. Progesterone, especially for women, but for men as well. Pregnenolone, which is really like the Godfather hormone. It's kind of the hormones, cholesterol start at pregnenolone, and then they can go into progesterone, they can go into DHEA and the others. So pregnenolone is kind of like the Godfather. DHEA is important. This especially, though, needs to not be too high in men. This can get easily converted to estrogen if it's too high in men. So you do have to watch that one, guys. Testosterone obviously is very protective, and especially to vital organs. Testosterone is actually highest in places like the heart, lungs, and brain because it protects from, where's cortisol at? Is that not? Oh, there it is. Because it protects from cortisol. Cortisol breaks tissues down, literally eats your body alive in order to make energy when it's needed. Again, that's okay when it's once in a while in acute stress and then it's done. But if you're constantly eating away your body, obviously not good. Testosterone protects against cortisol. Should, if it's there. If you're at 200, it's not doing much for you. Thyroid is obviously, and maybe not obviously to you yet, but is definitely probably a main focus of Ray Peat's work and many in the bioenergetic view. This would be almost a very, very central hormone that he would say is probably one of the biggest reasons why we have such terrible health right now. Now let's go on to insulin. This is maybe a surprising one. However, insulin does a great job when it's present at lowering these stress hormones. including glucagon down here as well. So this is why it's important to be regularly having some carbohydrates throughout the day. Will help push those stress hormones down. Carbon dioxide might be a surprising one for many of you as well, but carbon dioxide is truly the a very important marker for health, because when that's doing well and that's high enough, then it's helping push oxygen into the tissues at a better rate. A lot of people are excited about nitric oxide, which you'll notice is on the harmful side. And nitric oxide is really the backup to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the one you want to be fairly high and active. When it's low, then nitric oxide starts to take over, but it has a lot of negative side effects. I know you've heard, it's a vasodilator, but really carbon dioxide is the primary vasodilator we want. Nitric oxide comes with a lot of side effects when it's there chronically. And then GABA, also one of those protective good hormones. Let's move to these harmful ones, especially, all these hormones have a place. So it's not to say you want zero of any of these hormones. However, you want to picture them kind of like the sprinkler system in a business office. And so the sprinkler system is there and it will save you in the sense from, if there's truly a fire going on, you want that sprinkler system. It could save lives. It could save equipment, save a lot of money, save the building. However, when in excess or chronically there, it does more harm than good. It's a net negative. And in that analogy, you can imagine the sprinklers going off every day, even when there's not a fire. Now you're just destroying everything for no reason. And that's when these negative hormones don't know their boundaries. They push beyond and outside of their boundaries. And then they're active and suppressing all of these good hormones when they get out of control. So some of these hormones would be things like cortisol, adrenaline, probably familiar with those. Estrogen, we've talked about that a lot. That's a big one. Prolactin, for example, on a blood test, prolactin is actually a good marker to look at because it'll tell you if there's a bunch of estrogen hiding in your tissues. Even if your estrogen blood levels are totally fine or even low, you could still have very high estrogen. Prolactin would be a good marker to look at, and you would want that lower than the standard that's currently given at the low end or even lower. Serotonin is maybe another surprising one, called the happy hormone, but that one in its class of SSRIs, like we talked about, is a nasty hormone to have in excess and chronically. We talked about nitric oxide. Glucagon is one of those hormones that will start breaking down tissue, just like cortisol and adrenaline, to create glucose or energy because you're not getting enough in your diet or you're too stuck on fat burning. And that is a destructive hormone to have chronically high. Growth hormone is maybe another surprising one, especially, bodybuilders or people that lift would generally say, oh yeah, we want lots of growth hormone, but you want it at very strategic places and you want it only when it's needed most. For example, going through a growth spurt. However, this is not the primary function of growth hormone to just give you bigger muscles when you're lifting. We're going to be quick, so I'm going to keep going. A lot to be said, but parathyroid hormone is also one you don't want to see high. That's a stress indicator. Aldosterone, angiotensin, these are things often related to blood pressure. You don't want those working. If those are high in working, that means you have a problem. Your backup system is kind of on, the generator is on. And so you need to go fix the problem, which is usually due to, maybe surprisingly too, low salt intake in the diet. Okay, and then we've got TSH that we mentioned and histamine, of course. So hopefully this gives you a good big picture of Ray Peat, what he did, and some of those controversial statements, and the big overall view of hormones. We didn't talk about how they affect the body that much, but at least you get the idea of the kind of the good guys, the abundance type hormones, and then the ones that overstep their bounds and cause chaos, Those are the famine type hormones, and those are on the right side.